examining how migrants' voting rights, or lack thereof, are shaping democracy worldwide. For today's event, we have prepared an engaging program featuring keynote remarks, a presentation of the report's key findings, and a panel discussion with distinguished speakers, followed by a Q&A session. To start, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kevin Casas-Zamora, Secretary General of International IDEA, who will deliver the opening remarks. Kevin, please.
Hello, and welcome to all of you to this launch of International Ideas 2025 Global State of Democracy Report. It's great to see how many of you are joining us despite the best efforts of the weather in Stockholm to spoil the party. So thank you for coming here, and also thank you to all of you that are joining this conversation online from all over the world. I'm Kevin Casas-Zamora, the Secretary General of International IDEA. For any of you who are not so familiar with our institute, we are an intergovernmental organization with 35 member states from all regions, dedicated to supporting democracy worldwide. As part of this mandate, we have an important role as one of the leading voices in assessing the quality and performance of democracies around the world. Each year, these efforts culminate in the publication of our flagship report, The Global State of Democracy, which is what brings us together today. In what remains of this brief opening remarks, I hope to do two things. First, I want to give you a sense of how International IDEA assesses democratic performance. And second, I will give you a glimpse of this year's main findings as a preview of the presentation that will follow. International IDEA's Global State of Democracy initiative is a unique combination of comparative data, timely analysis, and policy-relevant publications. Our research leverages our global presence and expertise, our comprehensive quantitative databases, and our innovative democracy tracker, which assesses democracy qualitatively on a continuous basis. We aim to reflect global, regional, and country-level trends while also capturing emerging phenomena relevant to democracy. Our approach is granular, assessing democratic performance in 173 countries, the vast majority of the world, around four big dimensions, namely representation, rights, rule of law, and participation, rather than aggregating results into a single score or ranking. As an intergovernmental organization, we're only able to provide such broad and deep analysis because many of our member states support it through the Institute's core budget. So to them, I want to express my gratitude, not only from our institute, but on behalf of the policymakers, practitioners, and researchers worldwide who use our findings to understand and support democracy. To increase the impact of our research and to bring greater attention and focus to our policy recommendations, we now structure each annual report in two parts. The first part of the report is an assessment of how democracy is performing globally, illustrated through cases from all over the world, as well as tables showing countries' relative performance in each of the four categories that I just mentioned. The second part of the report is a thematic policy paper illuminating a specific issue or phenomenon or trend and providing policy recommendations related to it. This year, our report focuses on migration. Over 300 million people now reside outside their country of birth. This figure has tripled since the 1970s. The political inclusion or exclusion of these people in their countries of citizenship reflects important questions about national belonging and civil rights in a modern democracy. Such questions are both philosophical but also very practical. And just as migration trends are rendering these questions unavoidable for democracies around the world, so too must they be considered by organizations like International IDEA, which aim to support and improve democracy. Given our institute's global expertise at the nexus of electoral processes and democracy assessment, the thematic section of this year's report focuses specifically on the topic of voting rights for citizens living abroad and what can be done to enable their exercising of the most basic of political rights. Now, against this background, let me share with you a few highlights from this year's report. Unfortunately, but perhaps unsurprisingly, things are not getting better for democracy globally. 2024 was the 9th consecutive year in which more countries decline in terms of their democratic performance rather than improved. This is the longest consecutive fall since International IDEA's records began in 1975, half a century. While the headlines have tracked the travails of democracy at a broad scale, from authoritarianism and conflict to inequality and polarization, our report this year reveals serious challenges within most aspects of democracy. Representation, rights, and the rule of law all suffered significant declines over the past 5 years. And I want to underscore that this is a global problem. There are few, if any, safe spaces for democracies anywhere. If we look at the rule of law, for instance, we see that most declines occur here in Europe, where performance has been historically robust. Across all aspects of democracy, only participation scores stayed relatively constant. This confirms our previous findings that much of democracy's lingering resilience comes from civic engagement, including in regions that are suffering deterioration in other facets of democracy. Yet, if participation remains a rare source of stability for democracy, it can be made stronger still and in ways that also reinforce representation, rights, and democracy overall. Our report finds that expanding political participation through out-of-country voting for citizens abroad can support democratic resilience in both the home and host countries. And I really hope that policymakers will read this section of the report as an opportunity to advance democratic inclusion and legitimacy in an increasingly mobile and uncertain world. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Secretary General, for that thoughtful overview of the report itself, but also of the work that International IDEA does. Now, I am very pleased to bring us to the keynote address, and I have the privilege to welcome Ms. Cecilia Jimenez de Mare, former United Nations Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur on Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons, and a renowned international human rights lawyer. Cecilia joins us all the way from the Philippines, and we are very pleased and honored to have her with us here today. So please.
Oops. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you. I'm a bit short for this, and thank you for having me come all the way to Stockholm. Thank you for this opportunity to deliver the keynote address on today's report launch. It's always, to tell the truth, a much-awaited annual report for us political analysts, academics, advocates, as well as, of course, policymakers. The global state of democracy is known for its evidence-based analysis and recommendations, which is why when I was a UN Special Rapporteur for the human rights of internally displaced persons, I actually had the privilege of working with International IDEA in drafting my report on the voting rights of internally displaced persons. That report was presented to the United Nations Human Rights Council. Congratulations to the organization for this year's thought-provoking report, produced today in a world today that continues to reel from increasingly shaky foundations of democratic ideals and practice. I also give thanks to the organization for ensuring that in the midst of our discussion of democracy, the report also reminds us of the ongoing challenges in the situation of Gaza that point to the shaky foundations of international law and democracy. The situation in Gaza emphasizes that democracy is also an imperative for all, an imperative for solidarity, and that democratic ideals are not meant to be selective in its application. As in previous iterations, this year's report is a sobering read. Indeed, in the context of the overall decline of democratic indices that the GSOD elaborates on, this year's theme, Democracy on the Move, comes at a time when persons subject of mobility and displacement, despite increasing numbers of people across borders and demographic demands from both sending and destination countries, they are treated as exceptions to, or at best, minimal token recipients of democratic prerogatives. Let me quote an important portion of the report on this matter, which the Secretary General has also said, that migration now affects a growing share of the world's population. 304 million people, or 3.7% of the global population, lives outside their country of birth in 2025. These are important findings that reconfirm that actually migration is a normal pattern of the world's population's resilient attempt to evolve, to progress, to reinvent itself, not merely as individuals, but collectively as societies. Moreover, migration has, especially intensively, functioned as safety valves for those fleeing wars, violence, and extreme poverty in the human yearning for a better world. At worst, migrants, or as the report says, immigrants or emigrants, or non-citizens of a given country and whatever their legal status, are seen to merely provide needed services without the human rights that pertain to them as human beings. At the very worst, yes, it can be worse, as per the horrific visuals from the United States come to us, migrants have no rights and can be thrown as easily into arbitrary detention, disappearance, or deportation, the dreaded triple Ds, because allegedly democracy and rights do not apply to them. What is the role, therefore, of democracy here? Democracy has traditionally been seen as a set of ideological tenets that originally emphasized that power is held by the people, mainly citizens. However, with the parallel evolution of fundamental rights that pertain to all human beings, regardless of citizenship and spatial dimensions, it is now more necessary to synchronize the rights of non-citizen immigrants in a country not their own with democratic ideals. At the same time, immigrants are citizens of their home countries, to which they normally retain their links and political rights. A big part of the report studies the so-called out-of-country voting that have been established by some countries, including mine, in attempts to confirm those links and provide representation and participation while their citizens are abroad. despite the dismal findings overall in the report pointing to the ideals of democracy, the indices, and the OCV itself with disappointingly low turnouts, the OCVs have emerged over recent time as a necessary political representation mechanism that enables not merely participation, but, where possible, cross-border influences, positive and negative as well. In other words, for democracy to apply in the context of migration, it necessitates us to regard the real-life situation of an immigrant or emigrant living in two so-called worlds. Fortunately, my own lived-in experience, and this is probably not known to international idea, my own lived-in experience cannot be deemed as negative, as I myself lived in Europe, in Switzerland, as an emigrant for 18 years, during which time I established an international legal career. During that time, raising a family with children in local schools, contributing to the Swiss social life and economy, my world was divided between Switzerland and the Philippines. In my Swiss life, I was active in integration, voting on Swiss local issues pertaining to our village, and on a higher scale, engaging with Swiss policymakers to advocate for the protection of the rights of domestic workers working in the households of international diplomats. On the other hand, as a Filipino, I co-founded an organization, Geneva Forum for Philippine Concerns. We were active in Philippine community events. We published a Know Your Rights brochure for non-Swiss domestic helpers in English, French, and Spanish. And while enabling my countrymen and women to be aware of the human rights situation in the Philippines, we tried to facilitate a reconfirmation of democratic values across the borders. Last but not the least, we were part of European diaspora teams that sent delegations to our home country to lobby our parliament to enact what has eventually become the dual citizenship law of the Philippines and our own Overseas Voting Act. The consequence of the latter was, of course, additional advocacy on the diaspora being updated on the politics of the home country and an upscaling on the discourse of what political representation really means for the diaspora back home, and on the other hand, how Swiss democratic values can be strengthened. So it really works both ways. Obviously, therefore, any work to initiate, strengthen, and maintain the application of democratic tenets and mechanisms, be it in regard to the country of current residence and to the home country, is dependent on the rule of law and how those states protect human rights. First of all, the country hosting, the host country, must continue to respect, or must respect, because some don't, respect and protect the rights of migrant communities, not just individuals, and provide those conditions to enable immigrant communities to genuinely contribute to the political, social, and economic life of the hosting country. This includes possibility of participation in at least local governance decision-making, and of course, engagement in community and city activities that facilitate integration and societal contributions. Without this, the second one would not be very efficient. And the second is, of course, the home country should provide not only adequate and efficient mechanisms for participation and representation of their own citizenry rights, even while they are away from the country of origin, beyond overseas country voting. Of course, this entails that the system that has the overseas country voting where they exist Thus, do not merely regard overseas voters to be used during election time, but that the home country enables political representation and participation beyond the exercise of electoral rights. The reason I'm giving the two worlds is to emphasize that without one without the other does not make sense for a migrant. One may have overseas country voting, but if that person is not able to participate locally in the country where he or she lives, this is merely something that is incomplete as far as democratic relations are concerned. It is, of course, to be emphasized that the four indices, representation, rights, rule of law, and participation that the report analyzes applies to both countries of migration or destination and of origin. A more thorough research and analysis of these indices as applied in both types of spatial jurisdictions would be helpful not only at comparative levels, but also overall in the analysis of both the benefits and downsides of migrations, depending on who you speak with, for both states of migration and origin. The continuing challenge would also ensure that the research and advocacy would entail that no one is left behind. Moreover, that importantly, people on the move, wherever they are respected and protected as human beings with rights, and that in concrete situations, they can be counted on to contribute to democratic ideals wherever they are situated. In the end, the rule of law is, of course, founded on rights, enabling on representation and participation, and these apply to all people on the move. In conclusion, congratulations again for this year's report. It will be, as usual, no doubt, a good reference and use in our further research as an academic, policy work and advocacies throughout the world. Importantly, it provides us the following important timely messages in the context of democracy on the move that I would like to leave with you. The first one is democracy, as you rightly said, is a work in progress with much to be demanded from all stakeholders. And this includes not just policymakers and other stakeholders, but particularly the migrants themselves. Second, democracy is a global project. Again, nothing rocket science about that, but democracy is not confined within the borders. In fact, they go across borders, as this report tells us. And last but not the least, and I feel very, very adamant about this, democracy is not a technical, bureaucratic endeavor. In order to be effective and sustainable, I think I lost my last page. In order to be effective and sustainable, it definitely necessitates a people's approach and solidarity in those ideals that should be universally applied. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Jimenez de Mare, for your inspiring remarks and thoughtful comments, both on migration and democracy, as well as for your longstanding dedication to human rights, especially as concerns displaced people. It is an honor to have you with us here today. All right, we will now move into the heart of the Global State of Democracy 2025 report. Dr. Seema Shah, the head of the Democracy Assessment Unit at International IDEA, will present the key findings. So please, Seema.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2025 launch of International IDEA's flagship report, The Global State of Democracy. This year's report, Democracy on the Move, provides an overview of global and regional trends and presents new research on a question that we believe is key to the future of democracy. In an age of increasing migration and mobility, how is political participation changing And what must we do to protect it for everyone? Participation is especially critical now, in a time when long-standing institutions of democratic governance continue to deteriorate and support for people-centered power is weakening. Before we begin, it's important to understand how we at International IDEA define democracy. We define the concept based on two key pillars: popular control over decision-making and decision-makers, and equality in the exercise of that control. This broad definition is operationalized through the conceptual framework you see on the screen. We take democracy and we divide it into four categories: representation, rights, rule of law, and participation. As you can see, each of these categories has a number of factors and sub-factors associated with it that we aggregate into that broad category. The data that feed all of these hexagons you see on the screen consist of 154 individual indicators of democracy and rights in 173 countries around the world, starting in 1975 and going through the end of 2024. These indicators come from 22 of the most credible and sophisticated data sets in the world on these topics. We believe that our focus on the category and factor level, rather than on classifying a regime as a democracy or not, allows us to provide important nuance in our analysis, identify areas of progress and decline, and create more targeted and effective policy recommendations. In addition to our data, as always, our analysis is strengthened by our regional and country-based experts around the world who provide invaluable perspectives on the issues that we investigate today from within those contexts. The rest of the presentation will proceed as follows. I will start with a broad overview of what the data tell us about the state of democracy and trends we see around the world. This will be followed by an explanation of what we found in the research we conducted on migration with a special focus on out-of-country voting, and I will close with a set of policy recommendations. Let's start by looking at global trends. First, the quality of democracy around the world continues to deteriorate, with 2024 the 9th consecutive year in which net declines outnumbered net advances. Compared to 5 years ago, the number of countries experiencing at least one significant decline in a key factor of democratic quality is far greater than those with at least one advance. The difference here, as you can see on the screen, is significant, more than 20 points. Examples include declines in indicators like freedom of the press and credible elections in all regions of the world. But as the graph shows, there has also been some progress. We have seen advances in countries as diverse as Poland, Sri Lanka, and Zambia, which have seen advances in factors as varied as freedom of expression, predictable enforcement, and credible elections. A look now at the regional level shows us that African countries accounted for the largest share of global declines at about 33%. As you can see, Africa was followed by Europe, Asia and the Pacific, and then by the Americas and West Asia. If you now look at the blue bars, you can see the number of relative advances around the world. And here you can see that Africa and the Americas are tied, but you can also see that the global distribution of advances is quite evenly distributed across the regions, except for West Asia. Some notable examples here include Chile, Bangladesh, Zambia, and Latvia. Some of these advances are due to milestone changes in power, such as those in Bangladesh or Zambia, while others reflect more incremental advances. Many of the declines that we see in the data appear to have continued in 2025, with the United States exemplifying the deterioration. Between January and May of this year alone, our Democracy Tracker tool picked up 20 individual events of concern just in the United States, spanning 3 of the 4 categories. As events of the last 2 days show us, concerns about the rule of law continue. Moving now to factors that were most impacted, it is clear that at the global level, Declines have been most concentrated first in representation, especially in credible elections and effective parliament, in rights, especially in access to justice and civil liberties, and in rule of law, especially with regard to judicial independence, predictable enforcement, and personal integrity and security. What this means is that people cannot count on the institutions that are meant to represent their interests, nor can they depend on the ability to freely engage in debate and voice their opinions about those representative institutions. To make it worse, unequal opportunities and access to the levers of power mean that some voices are continuously marginalized. This means that even where democracies do exist, their direction may be unfairly shaped and influenced by only certain segments of society. It's also worth noting that our report focuses on change, but a pattern that underlines or is more hidden than the change is one of stability. So if we look at the data, we also see that between 2019 and 2024, every country in the data set did maintain stable performance in at least one factor of democratic quality. If we look closely now at the four categories, we can understand important details. Within representation, we know that the broadest declines were in credible elections and effective parliament. Note the number of declining countries in effective parliament, which is more than triple the number of advancers. Several of the lowest performers here experienced a coup or other undemocratic transfer of power, while others continued to be affected by violent conflict. Examples include Afghanistan, Haiti, Myanmar, and Syria. Others, like El Salvador, Kuwait, Russia, and Venezuela, also saw declining scores in effective parliament because their legislatures have either been co-opted by executives or have been abolished altogether. But again, despite these declines, we also see advances. So credible elections indicators have declined around the world, but it's important to note that elections still hold considerable power, both practically and symbolically, for change. And what we saw is that comparing 2024 to 2019, Brazil and Poland have each shown significant improvement in multiple factors following an election. In the case of Brazil, improvements spanned all four categories of our framework. In previous years, both countries had been impacted by consistent democratic deterioration, including executive aggrandizement, the undermining of the rule of law and independence of the courts, constraints on the media, and restrictions in the space for civil society. Although both contexts remain challenging today, there has been progress in reversing several of the non-democratic policies of the past. When we come to rights, the most far-reaching decline was in freedom of the press. Performance here declined in 43 countries, nearly 1/4 of all the countries that we cover. You can see here a zoomed-in version of how things have changed between 2004 and 2024. And you can see that the number of declines in this factor in 2024 is more than 8 times the number 2 decades ago. While 4 of the top 5 largest drops in freedom of the press were in already low-performing contexts like Myanmar, Afghanistan, Burkina Faso, and Nicaragua, mid-range performing South Korea was also in this list of top 5. This was due to events like the cancellation of a well-known investigative journalist's daily program, a spike in defamation cases against journalists initiated by the government, and raids on journalists' residences. These incidents continued in 2024 with the establishment of a special investigative prosecutorial team targeting journalists for defamation. It now remains to be seen whether the new administration will be able to reverse some of these declines. But freedom of the press was not the only factor that declined within the rights category. We also saw drops in freedom of expression, economic equality, and access to justice. But as you can see on the screen, each of these also has a number of advancers. For freedom of expression, Chile tops the list, standing out for large advances that are due in part to landmark draft legislation aimed at enhancing the safety of journalists as well as their families. If approved by the legislature, the bill would introduce several novel features, including a broad definition of aggression that goes beyond physical aggression to include surveillance and digital harassment. Within rule of law, drops were almost equal in number across the three factors of judicial independence, predictable enforcement, and personal integrity and security. With regard to judicial independence, the declines affected countries at all levels of performance, low, mid-range, and high, with the most severe declines in Afghanistan, Chad, Myanmar, El Salvador, Tunisia, and Palestine. On Palestine, it's important to note that our data are limited to a state's actions inside of its territory. As a result, our data do not show how Israel's actions outside its borders affect representation, rights, rule of law, and participation. But of course, we know that they do. This issue of transnational democracy is something to think more deeply about. What does a country's actions beyond its borders say about the state of that country's democracy? How might such actions be measured and assessed? These are big questions, and we will need to consider them carefully going forward. Then we see declines in predictable enforcement. The declines are 3 times the number of advances, with Africa and Europe accounting for more than 60% of the declines globally. Personal integrity and security was also impacted, though more than half of the declining countries there were already low performing, suggesting that insecurity is deepening in already weak contexts. One surprising finding is with regard to absence of corruption, where we see that the number of advancing countries outweighs the number of declining ones. This marks the 15th consecutive year of this pattern. Importantly, though, half of these countries remain in the low-range performance band, and the overall numbers are still small, representing only about 10% of the countries in our data set. The Americas alone accounted for about a third of all the advances in absence of corruption, with Guatemala standing out as an illustrative case of both progress and challenge. There, the president was elected on an anti-corruption platform and assumed office in a context of deeply entrenched corruption. Since assuming office, he has undertaken steps toward reform, including removing thousands of government positions on the basis of insufficient qualification, and he has led efforts to take complaints to the public prosecutor's office and to the attorney general, despite the fact that the attorney general and others in the administration have sought to counter the legitimacy of his electoral win. Participation was the category that saw the least change, with only a handful of countries having exhibited any movement at all. But still, where there was change, the declines were more than the advances. Only one country shows advances in the factor of civic engagement, and that is France, and only 4 in civil society: Brazil, Fiji, Malawi, and Zambia. Deterioration in civic engagement was observed in low and mid-range performing countries, with African countries accounting for almost 60% of all the declines. At the same time, our approach allows us to show that nuance I was talking about. And so 6 of the top 20 performing countries in civic engagement are African countries. Civic space is a special concern for Latin America, where there are long-term declines in civil society's ability to operate freely, including in places like Argentina, Bolivia, El Salvador, and Nicaragua and Venezuela. But as we all know, participation does not take place only within the boundaries of one's country. Ours is a world on the move, and new modes of participation offer us ways to make our voices heard no matter where we are. We now turn our attention to this story of human migration, a phenomenon as old as our species. In fact, as migration rates increase, the question of how to ensure and protect the exercise of rights for those on the move is unavoidable, and the question will only grow in importance as we move forward. The urgent need to drive forward this conversation is what motivates Part 2 of the Global State of Democracy report this year. While it is true that humans have always moved, exploring and seeking new opportunities, it's clear that rates of international migration continue to grow today. Between 1970 and 2024, the number of people who live outside the countries of their birth has more than tripled. While these approximately 300 million individuals represent less than 4% of the global population, the trend is clearly an upward one. And though it may be surprising, what we know about patterns of migration is that intra-regional migration rates dwarf inter-regional migration. You can see that on the graph here. If you follow the thickest parts of each band, you'll see that intra-regional migration rates are much higher. When people do migrate internationally, the majority stay within the continents of their birth. Given all these trends, we feel it's important to think about if, how, and why people on the move participate in political processes and what opportunities they're given to do so. The reason for this is because we know that participation contributes to democratic resilience, or the ability to weather, recover, and grow from crises. One key mechanism of participation is, of course, voting. And for immigrants, the key is out-of-country voting, or OCV. Evidence indicates that OCV helps promote a continued sense of belonging and social cohesion in countries of origin, as well as in host countries, which can contribute to a long-term democratic resilience. Tunisia extended OCV to its non-resident citizens after the 2011 revolution as an act of democratic renewal and unity. France has long integrated these ideas, creating an assembly of French citizens abroad to symbolize the inclusion of its global citizenry. Evidence indicates that OCV can also contribute to democratic diffusion, or the spread of democratic norms across borders, through things like return migration or regular contact between immigrants and their home countries. It can also contribute to a greater sense of belonging within diaspora communities in host countries. When those individuals, for example, join a political association or a civic association, it can strengthen the ties between them, creating a new sense of belonging and greater integration. For those who decide to return home, OCV can also reduce the barriers to reintegration. And thankfully, there are lots of ways in which OCV can take place, including in-person voting, proxy voting, postal voting, and online voting. International Ideas Voting from Abroad database reveals that many immigrants come from places that provide multiple means of OCV. In fact, only about a quarter of the countries in that data set don't provide for this mechanism at all. At the same time, the majority of countries that do only allow for in-person voting, for example, at a diplomatic mission. Interestingly, despite technological advances, online voting remains rare. While all these varied options do exist, it's important to note that in practical terms, access can still be quite restricted. In some jurisdictions, OCV is limited only to government employees. That's the case, for example, in India or in Ireland. Or it can be restricted to members of the military or students who are studying abroad. The lack of capacity or will to implement the law, as well as serious crises, can also impact access. Conflicts in Sudan, Syria, and Yemen are just a few examples. Despite all these benefits, diaspora turnout rates tend to be relatively low. It's difficult for us to definitively describe the rates because the data is so limited and because different ways of categorizing it make it hard for us to do cross-country comparisons. What we do know, though, is we took a look at all the elections that occurred in 2024. And what we found is that as a share of registered voters, the turnout rate was 55.3% when looking at elections turnout for people at home. When we did that same, turnout for people abroad. When we did that same calculation for registered voters at home, the turnout rate is 60%. This doesn't seem like a huge difference, but remember that not all countries require registration. So these numbers only represent that select number of people who take the trouble to do that. What would really be useful is knowledge about how many of the eligible immigrants around the world cast a ballot. We're very lucky today to have Professor Baubach with us, who leads the world in terms of research on this topic. And one of his very newest studies shows that about 74 million people of the immigrant community remained disenfranchised in 2020. So we'll be hearing more about that in just a few minutes. It also shows us how deep this problem is. So why don't people participate? Well, we know that registration requirements can create problems, especially when it's required well in advance of an election. This can restrict access to people with limited time, limited information, or a weak connection to the electoral process. We also know that when countries offer more than one way to vote from abroad, turnout is better. If a country only offers in-person voting, for example, you can imagine that self-exiled individuals might face security threats by going to an embassy or a diplomatic mission to cast their ballot. Just as with domestic turnout, OCV rates can also be influenced by practical and political matters. Turnout may be higher when an election is seen as a turning point, or when new procedures make voting easier. When a political party engages with immigrants, that has also been shown to increase turnout. Some of these issues are top of mind for Ukraine. There, many of those forced to flee still maintain a strong sense of national identity and a desire to remain engaged in their country's political processes. While Ukraine currently provides OCV at diplomatic missions, the displacement of millions of its citizens across Europe and beyond have placed a new strain on the electoral system. Relying only on embassy-based voting may no longer be sufficient to ensure inclusive participation. Regardless of turnout rates, disparities in immigrant representation and procedural access reflect broader questions about equality and legitimacy in democratic systems. There are concerns about the fact that the decision to expand suffrage may be motivated by only one party's desires. There have been allegations along these lines in places like Hungary or Turkey. Also, some people make the argument that immigrants who don't live with the daily consequences of electoral outcomes may have an outsized influence over those outcomes, threatening the broad legitimacy of the winner. The existence of overseas constituencies also raises questions about the connection between national territory and the definition of the polity. In Canada, for example, there were objections to Canadian citizens with dual citizenship having special representation in the legislatures of France and Tunisia. Okay, so what should we do? In the report, we have separate recommendations for policymakers, electoral management bodies, and civil society. But here I will just provide a very brief overview of the recommendations aimed at policymakers. First, we recommend that policymakers view out-of-country voting, or OCV, as a tool for democratic resilience. It can strengthen democratic legitimacy by reinforcing immigrants' sense of civic belonging and sustaining their political engagement. Second, ensure inclusion in the national political community by making sure that legal frameworks are guided by inclusive understandings of citizenship that recognize the legitimate stake that non-resident citizens have in the political future of their countries of origin. This is going to be increasingly important as migration rates grow in the future, driven by things like the climate emergency, digital connectivity, and so many other factors. In 2025, Kosovo offered out-of-country voting for its elections, and it featured an easier registration process and more options to cast a ballot. That resulted in record turnout for that country in 2025. Third, balance political representation with electoral equity. Where immigrant populations are large, weighting mechanisms or capped seat allocations could be considered, as used in countries like Cabo Verde, which may provide a model for balancing immigrant representation and legitimacy. Fourth, prioritize legal clarity, cross-border coordination, and long-term planning. Effective OCV requires early legislative action, legal clarity on who is actually eligible to vote and how to vote, and coordination, of course, with host country institutions. Fifth, adopt a cost-effective and inclusive approach to OCV. We know that postal voting and multiple voting methods, especially when you combine in-person with postal voting, work, and they're relatively affordable. New approaches like online voting should be explored with attention to integrity, digital literacy, and security. And finally, invest in better data for better decisions. Sound policymaking requires more systematic and disaggregated data, and standardized reporting requirements for electoral management bodies might be an option which would make the job of us data analysts much easier going forward. The question of migration is ultimately one of belonging in a democratic society. It challenges us, not because migration itself is inherently destabilizing, but because it pushes us to ask difficult questions about if and how to reconsider the boundaries of a polity. Embracing a transnational conception of belonging may help people feel like they have a stake in the future of their countries of origin, no matter where they are, incentivizing them to stay connected and committed. At the same time, it's important not to lose sight of the views and priorities of resident citizens. It's a balancing act that will be different for each context. The work of democracy is never finished, and there is no single right answer. The best approaches will reflect local histories. What remains universally true is that the long-term resilience of democratic institutions depends on deliberate, inclusive, and regular reflection, and solutions that are tailored to context-specific problems and priorities. Thank you very much for your attention.
Wow, Seema, thank you so much for that really impressive presentation of the key findings of the Global State of Democracy report. The overview of the global trends, including the highlight of the steepest drop in press freedom in the last half a century, along with your analysis and the recommendations, really gave a lot of valuable insights and a lot for all of us to think about. To help us along in that thinking, I am very pleased to bring us into the next session, which will be the panel discussion, discussing the intersections between migration and democracy, and going deeper into this year's findings. I'm pleased to introduce our panel discussants. Dr. Linda Adiabo Auchu, migration expert and executive director, African Migration and Development Policy Center. Dr. Maria de Rosario Gonçalves, chairperson, National Electoral Commission of Cabo Verde, and Professor Dr. Rainer Baubach, political scientist and migration researcher. We're honored to welcome all of you and for you coming forward to share your expertise and experiences with us. The discussion will be moderated by Ms. Katarzyna Gardha-Patse, Director of Global Programs at International IDEA. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I have to say I have been reflecting a little bit on a discussion that I had yesterday on this year's report and the out-of-country voting as a Polish citizen. I have been always confronted with this dual debate. On one hand, of our biggest diaspora, which is in the United States, and whether or not they, being third, fourth generation immigrants, should still have a say in the national politics. And on the other, something that you said, diaspora should not be a subject of attention only when the election day comes, which is a typical thing for Poland, because the US diaspora, the Polish diaspora in the United States is only remembered before the election day. But I am very pleased and very honored to have fantastic panelists here with us today, and we are going to talk about the issues of out-of-country voting and look a little bit more about how the sense of belonging and transnational participation and representation can perhaps work better for everybody. And to get us started, I would like to ask our panelists a general question. And the general question is this: how does out-of-country voting intersect with democratic resilience? And I will start with Rainer.
Thank you, Katarzyna, and also to International IDEA for inviting me for this panel, and congratulations on this fantastic report, and also on combining the themes of the quality or the health of democracy worldwide with the particular question of the migrants' opportunities and chances to participate in the democratic process. through casting a vote in elections. Indeed, I think the most topical concern today is the global democratic recession and how this might interact with out-of-country voting, which is the topic of the second part of the report. And in the report, what you find is generally a positive assessment of out-of-country of voting and its impact on democratic resilience in the country of origin. It was, Seema Shah showed it on one of the slides. The idea is there's a positive relation between voting, developing a sense of inclusion, support for democratic norms, active participation or resistance to authoritarianism. I once called this the hypothesis of democratic remittances, not just economic, but democratic remittances that come from the diaspora back to the country of origin. Now, the report also has a caveat, which is very important. A high diaspora turnout cannot strengthen democratic resilience on its own, especially if domestic turnout is low or if diasporas are politically manipulated, end of quote. And I want to pick up on this second concern. What if the diaspora vote is manipulated or actually feeds into the autocratic decline of democracies? And here there are two possibilities. One is mentioned in the report and was also mentioned by Seema, which is that countries that are already declining or have turned into electoral democracies or electoral autocracies, in the VDEM terminology, use the diaspora vote in order to mobilize it against their domestic opponents and exercise control over that vote. The paradigmatic examples are Hungary and Turkey in my region of the world, in Europe. But there is also a second phenomenon, which is maybe even more troubling, that you find that a diaspora vote turns out to be in favor of autocratic candidates and against democratic candidates, even where autocratic candidates are not yet incumbents. They are not in power. They don't have the means to mobilize through government channels, but they use social media and other kinds of channels. If you look at the recent Romanian presidential elections, you saw that in the first round, 61% of the diaspora vote went for the far-right candidate, Simeon, which was far more than among the domestic voters. And that's in a way a surprise. It was a little bit lower in the second round because then the democratic people mobilized too. That's a surprise. Here you have a member state of the European Union, a democratic country of origin, and people who are overwhelmingly in democratic destination countries inside the European Union. And what they sent back is autocratic remittances rather than democratic remittances. How could this be explained? You could say, well, there's a general trend of the rise of the far right in European politics, but that doesn't explain why it's stronger among the diaspora than among the domestic voters. So that's a phenomenon I don't want to offer an explanation we should be looking at and be concerned about. Let me mention there are counterexamples, and one is very close by, that's Moldova, where again, in presidential elections, you saw that diaspora was heavily mobilized and turned out more strongly in favor of the democratic candidate, Ayasanu, and against the autocratic one compared to the domestic electorate. So let me just conclude this initial round by suggesting that as electoral battles are increasingly fought not only over policy issues, but over the nature of the political regime itself, OCV, out-of-country voting, after having been normalized as a democratic standard over many decades, might become again more controversial, both in migrants' countries of origin, because how it might tilt the vote in favor of one or the other regime option, and in host countries, which are worried that battles over regime change are imported from a country of origin into the domestic arena. And eventually, even their citizens might be elected to hold positions in a country of origin that is turning less democratic. I'm just throwing out these worries, and I think it would be very worthwhile looking at them in future editions of this very interesting report.
Thank you very much. You cannot even imagine the number of questions that this brought to my mind, also in the context of a situation of conflict and forceful displacement. But I will ask the same question now to Linda about the links between out-of-country voting and the intersection with democratic resilience in your mind.
Hey, thank you so much, the organizers, for the invitation. It was a very interesting report. It's my first time looking at migration and the democratic process, because normally I look at who's moving, why, and it's always politically linked. People talking about corruption or lack of rule of law. And when I was reading the report, it kept on taking me back to my experience as being a migrant and being in the diaspora and not seeing my connection and my sense of belonging. So when I was reading the second chapter, which was of interest to me, which was on the democracy and people on the move, there were so many things that resonated for me, in the sense that how do we have this sense of belonging as a diaspora? Because I left as a child, I returned as an adult, and I only saw myself as Kenyan the moment I returned and reintegrated. But this is my individual experience, and I kept on thinking, what about those who have gone abroad and actually are still abroad because they cannot come back, return? I think the aspect that was brought up about you have key issues of where you come from, and you cannot return. So how do you exercise your political right? You know, and that's something that I saw when I was abroad, that Kenyans are very resilient in the sense that they try to ensure they are part of the process, even though they don't have the political right to vote. And the way that happened is the diaspora policy in itself. Initially, the first stages of the diaspora policy, I'll give you context, personal experience, in the sense that in 2004, I think, no, 2014, sorry, I have to speed up a bit. There was a lot of engagement as to what do Kenyans in diaspora want, and there was an engagement of how do they want their rights to be upheld, including their right to vote. And it was very interesting how they were talking about what he put very interestingly, political remittances, which is something that I think sometimes governments don't even pay attention to, because it's an aspect where they are more concerned about the economic remittances and contributions, and they forget that their people are representatives of the country. As Kenyans, they tell us we are the ambassadors of our country. So if we represent our country badly, then obviously everyone will think Kenyans are in one way, in a negative way. But this report really stood out to me in the sense that talking about the sense of belonging, talking about those entry points where migrants can actually play a role in influencing the direction of politics. And I think more recently, I don't know if you pay attention to what's happening in Kenya. The political space has become very interesting because the diaspora are heavily involved in the digital space to hold the government accountable. And that is where they're joining forces with the Gen Z to sort of like push the political agenda and to ensure that the right person is in a position and they're voted from the people from abroad and from those within the country. So we're seeing this joining of forces, which is something we've never seen before. And I think that's something that would be useful for us to pay attention to for the new future, because I think that politically, democratically, things are shifting. But this report, I think the reflection on how migrants play a role in out-of-country voting is quite critical. And we see that in the sense that they are pushing for certain things to be in place for them to do that. But obviously, it's very difficult, it's expensive. Some of them are not even aware of the process, or they have not actually have that connection with the country of origin, second and third generation migrants. But we're seeing a shift. So I like the fact that this report is highlighting key aspects that allow us to see the bigger picture, and actually looking at the facts and figures made me think, I kept on thinking Africa is not doing so well. Then I realized it's the whole country, it's the whole world. So it's something that we need to pay attention to more closely. And this is something that obviously going forward as a researcher, because I research from the perspective of migrants going abroad and how they can actually influence policy discussions, but I've never looked at it with the democratic lens. So it actually added more questions for me in my future research, and more in line with AI technology. So I think in terms of ensuring there's out-of-country voting, especially in Africa. I think there's a lot of awareness that needs to go in not only for those in the country of origin, but those in diaspora, because I feel like they don't, not all of them are on board, but they can be on board at the same time. But it's a process where the government has to make efforts to also engage with them on that aspect and not just look at the economic remittances, but diasporic remittances among other aspects of that. So maybe I hand over to you and we can take the conversation from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. Actually, I just read one of the foresight exercises about the future of the digital participation was exactly saying that the digital organization of diaspora groups will change the way people engage in domestic politics. And that is an important point. So Maria, now the same question to you. How does out-of-country voting intersect with democratic resilience?
Okay, thank you very much. What time I have? Two? Two? Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I extend my greetings with all protocol observers. I want to take this opportunity to thank you, International IDEA, and our daughter Filomena, Consul of Cape Verde in Sweden, for this opportunity to be here to discuss with you Cape Verde electoral process. It's like a great honor. Thank you very much. And I want to congratulate IDEA for 13 years supporting democracy around the world. And in respond directly your questions, I would like to say that in Cape Verde, my country, voting abroad contribute to democracy resilience effectively for 15 years. And normally, voting abroad contribute for straining representation and inclusions. We believe that broadened a spectrum of voice in political by incorporating perspective from the diaspora that would otherwise overlook. We believe in Cape Verde that this inclusion racial decisions mitigating discourse limited to the national territories. And for us, voting in diaspora also strengthens institution legitimacy. We think that, and trust. Because we believe that by ensuring accessibility mechanism for electoral participation by the diaspora, the state, in this case, Cape Verde, demonstrated that all citizens is equal important. And that inclusion of otherwise voters legitimize also mandates and reduce suspicions of exclusion, making the system more resilient to credibility crisis. Also, we believe that this process in abroad constitute of the process in times of crisis. And we think that because in 2021, in COVID pandemic, we had 2 elections to make, presidential elections and parliamentary elections. But we had a big crisis, international crisis, very complicated situations. But we did 2 elections in the diaspora, in all the 21 countries, in all 3 continents. And we face a lot of logistical challenge. So people to work in election challenge, but we made it. So I believe for us in Cape Verde, this crisis made us more stronger. And improve a lot of our credibility and confidence in our electoral process. And I believe that election in diaspora is important for electoral innovation lab technology, because when we do elections, we serve a global electoral drive to the development of technology and logistical solutions, such as automatic voter registration in embassy, which is currently being implemented in this moment. We can also brought to our territory this experience in diaspora, so we can test it also for the territory national. So it can this experience in diaspora would be expanded to domestic voting, improve our electoral process. And last, it's very important for us. This election in Cape Verde is very expensive. We have a lot of problems, but it's important for us because we believe that these elections improve social cohesion and global citizenship, because voting in diaspora strengthens the emotional and political behind between the diaspora and country of origins. We believe that voters normally, we think, who felt like they are part of national community. And this election, this process abroad, tend to keep strong our culture, our economy, and promote stability and solidarity in times of tensions. So for us, this process is something, is a key. We have to work to improve that, but we never think that we have to stop with this because we have difficulty, financial difficulty, logistical difficulty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. And I will say it's a woman leader speaking. When someone says this crisis has made us stronger, you exactly know who's talking. And also because you have been an inspiration, you are one of very few heads of electoral commission globally who is actually a woman in a very still male-dominated universe. So thank you very much for this. I wanted to ask you, you talked about legitimacy, you talked about credibility, you talked about the importance of investing in this field in innovation. So based on your experience, what are practical mechanisms that have proven most effective for your out-of-country voting practice? And that actually also brings me to a question from the audience, which is how these were made inclusive and made sure that women's voices are heard and taken into account.
Okay. Thank you very much. As I said, it is a long process, 15 years, but we are improving. Sometimes we have problems. And I can mention some practical mechanism implemented by Cape Verde to make moving in the voting diaspora more effectively. First, I want to register voter registrations is a key question in the legitimacy for elections process. So we implemented in Cape Verde permanent posts in the embassy. But in some countries that we have a lot of community, Portugal, United States, France, in electoral occasions, we have also posts outside of the embassy. So we have some machine to keep people in the community and to bring them to our voter base. So also we also create diaspora electoral circumstance. Initially, we didn't have the people voting, but vote for Cape Verde. You don't have it, but we implemented it. 6 dedicated representative place in our parliament for diaspora, 2 for Europe and rest of the world, 2 to America and 2 to Africa. I believe that this was an important decision to bring to our parliament people from diaspora to come to discuss, to put these problems of community in abroad and to be more inclusive. So we also, in some country, not China, China is the only country don't allow us to go ahead to put, to make elections in the community, only in the embassy and the consulate representative. But in other countries, and where we have a large community, like United States, France, Portugal, we can put, normally we put voting tables in the community, many voting table in the community. We did installation of polling stations in urban centers to be more closely for the community to facilitate the vote, because our vote is only in personal voting. We simplify also documentations, because we know when our citizens go to the other country, sometimes they have no more Cape Verdean documents, or the document is expired, is out of the validity. So we allowed them to vote with CV Cape Verde documents, even the document is expired. So recently, we decided to allow Cape Verdean to vote with the document of the country where he belongs. It means that his Cape Verdean voter live here, he only have passport for this country, he can vote if he is on the list to facilitate them. So it is recently decisions. We have also diplomatic representation as a participant in electoral logistic and operations. So electoral commission, we have one or two representatives in each country, but we need more logistical support. Then this consul or embassy people work in the logistical and operational issues. And last, we invest also in the technology and innovations. But in Cape Verde, we have election today, and at the end of the day, we have the result. And we standardize for the diaspora. We did the same for diaspora. We use the technology to have all results for all countries in same times. And we believe that this ensure that votes from the diaspora are quickly content and reported. That the system, and we believe that this system, the electoral system transmission of results by the internet, also strengthens the legitimacy of the immigrants' participations, and also help to reduce the feeling of political distance between country and the diaspora. So we have other solutions. In this moment, our government is making a map. We want to know how many we have, our citizens around the world. We estimate that there are 3 times more, yes, in the country. So we want to know where they are, how much and to take specific political to bring all country to our elections. Okay, so I believe, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is really fascinating. I wish we had time to hear more. But I will now turn to Linda. Linda, your research looks not only at economic or political aspects of migration, but is deeply human. It puts the human in the center. I wanted to ask you, in your recent work, what is this transnational political engagement that you are observing? What trends you're observing, and what are the implications for democracy?
Okay, thank you for that question. I think when you gave me that question, I had to look at the 10 years, 15 years ago to see whether something has changed in that sense, in terms of transnational engagement of diaspora in voting. And I think it has changed significantly. And I feel like what we were seeing is that the longer a migrant stays outside of the country, the stronger the connection they have with their country of origin. Most people, when they used to migrate, especially in Kenya, there was an issue of I'm going abroad and I'm going to start a new life. But then as they go and they stay longer, they start to feel more Kenyan outside of their country. So you find, I've not done a research, but I've seen a pattern in the sense that people start engaging with their community dynamics. They start to go deeper into the community that they never grew up in. And they start to learn about the political dynamics, their rights in that community, which is something that is very rare that you cannot see. And then when they come to Kenya, they want to know all the processes and be involved in that aspect. So I feel that the trends are shifting in such a way that people are aligning and trying to find a sense of belonging with their country of origin, and not only the country of origin, the community of the origin, because they want to not only politically contribute, but they want to economically contribute to the community, but also socially, because they want to be part of the process. They want to help the young people to be part of the process. And I remember seeing there's a lot of diaspora engaging the young community on voting in the last election, because the young people did not see the impact of their vote. And now, as you see what has happened, the reason why they're now pushing for it is because they were being affected by the impact of the current government's approach. And it was as simple as the government is suggesting that if you're cohabiting in your parents' home, you still have to pay taxes. And that actually made young people pay attention more. And through that, I think what I've been seeing is more diaspora engagement with the young people on what are their rights, how can they be more involved. They're even giving them the rule of law, what they can or cannot do while they're out there. I remember when there were protests, there were so many apps that came up that kind of tell people safe zones. And some of those apps were created in partnership with the diaspora and the young people. So I feel like the trends are shifting. I'm not sure if it's positive or negative or in between. It's hard to say, but it's something that we are paying attention to more recently, because we realize there's a stronger connection between the diaspora and the people in the country of origin. And there's a strong interest in influencing political dynamics at the county level. And that was never there before. So I feel like it's an aspect that needs further investigation. I feel like as researchers, sometimes we just look at the obvious questions. What are the drivers? And we always say it's political, but what specifically politically is driving them? What can bring them back? What can help them reintegrate? And what I see with the diaspora is that they want to come back. They want to be part of the voting process because they plan to come back to retire. And they need to retire in a country that is safe, not corrupt, and they're able to influence decisions. So I feel like there's a lot of things that we're seeing going back and forth that are positive and negative. But at the same time, it's something that is progressive in the sense that we're not where we were 15, 20 years ago, where diaspora did not have a say or a vote. They are more vocal. There's a stronger interest in them being part of the process, not only in terms of voting, but also policy design. Simple thing like labor migration. If they're talking about labor migration to Germany or wherever, the Kenyans in Germany are vocal about what are the needs of the people who have already been there, then the gaps that the government has to meet essentially. So I think it's an observation that I have been noting, and I'm a bit jealous about Cape Verde. They seem to be way ahead of us. I feel like we need to do some lessons learned in that aspect, but obviously context matters. We need to obviously see what are the realities on the ground in terms of access to out-of-country voting. But at least it's progressive from 2017 until now. We've seen more diaspora voting. We've seen more voting booths being created, but it's now a question of access to some of these voting booths because some people may not live in a particular geographical area. But then it's something that I see a lot more diaspora and the people in the country of origin being involved in a conversation jointly. And I don't know whether it's because of the current political dynamic in the country or in the region, but it's something that has become has taken center stage in Kenya. So the trends are interesting at the moment, and I feel like we need to observe because we are going to be in election year in 2027. 2026 is campaign year, so everyone is watching to see what's going to happen. And already we've seen political parties going to the diaspora to convince them of supporting them of their vote. So we are all paying attention on how they're going to create access to those out-of-country voting. But it'll be interesting in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is indeed interesting. I also was listening with jealousy about the examples from Cabo Verde. Let's turn now to you, Rainer. Your scholarship has shaped how we globally understand citizenship, belonging, and democratic inclusion. And so how should we think normatively about the democratic rights of citizens abroad?
Well, this is a rather philosophical question you are asking here. So the question is basically, is there a democratic principle for determining who should have voting rights? And the obvious answer seems to be, well, democracy is about universal suffrage. That's a basic requirement. But what does universal suffrage mean in the context of migration? That's the big debate. And actually, many philosophers have participated in this debate, including Swedish ones like Ludwig Beckmann, who is sitting here in this room, has written important contributions on this debate, but it's called the boundaries of the demos. Who should be included among those people who vote? Basically, philosophers have come up with two principles. One is everybody who is subjected to the laws, and the other one is everybody whose interests are affected by the political decisions that are being taken. These principles pull in slightly different directions. The problem is that neither of them can easily justify what we observe in the real world, which is an expansion of voting rights towards diasporas, but also to a minor extent towards the non-citizen residents, the immigrants in the host countries. If you go by everybody who's subject to the laws, you could easily say, why should the Cape Verdean diaspora have a vote in elections if they stay abroad and are not subjected to most of the laws? And if you go for affected interests, you could ask, why should only the diaspora be included in the vote and not everybody else too? Why shouldn't we all have a vote in the next American presidential elections? We will all be deeply affected by the outcome of that election. So, this is in a way tongue-in-cheek, but the problem is there. So I've suggested a kind of alternative principle that builds on the insights of the two, that says it is about connections that individuals have to particular states and polities, but democracy needs to look for a non-ethnic principle of connection. And the right principle is to ask who has a stake in membership in a democratic polity and who has a stake in the future of a democratic polity. And if you ask that in that way, then it seems obvious that immigrants who are long-term residents do have a stake in the future in the membership, but also those who have left the country and maybe even the next generation have a stake of that kind. And therefore, there are good reasons for enfranchising both the immigrants and the diasporas, but not excessively. The diaspora, this must be limited because the fourth generation has lost any plausible stake in the country of origin. Now, this is the philosophy, but we've also thought about this. How can we find data to explain what's going on in the real world? And let me quickly show you data that have been released this afternoon. I wish I could share the link with you, but I really got it while I was waiting for the panel to start. This is a new data set called Migrants' Electoral Rights. It's global, it's longitudinal from 1960 to 2020 currently. And if we go for the usual perspective, if we look what countries do, then we see the blue line is the steeply rising line of countries that introduce diaspora voting. This is those countries that provide for electoral rights for their non-resident citizens, but do not provide for any rights for the immigrants in their own territory to vote. The yellow line is the converse. This is countries that provide only for immigrants electoral rights, mostly at the local level, but do not enfranchise their diasporas. The turquoise line is in between. They enfranchise both the diasporas and the immigrants in their territory, at least at the local level. And the dotted gray line is fortunately declining. This is the countries that disenfranchise migrants generally, both the diasporas and the immigrants in their territory. Now, this is the usual perspective that is also adopted naturally by the IDEA report. But we thought that's not the right perspective for capturing whether migrants are disenfranchised, because they are the diaspora of one country and the residents of another country. So by looking at any single country, you don't capture what's going on. So therefore, we have produced a new data set that is a dyadic data set that looks at the combination of countries of citizenship and countries of residence and asks, what is the bundle of electoral rights that migrants have in relation to both countries? Right? And here we condense this into just 6 different types, going from no franchise anywhere to the full franchise, which we operationalize as they can participate in national elections as non-citizens in the country of residence, in local elections in the country of residence, and in national elections in the country of origin, of which they are citizens. And in between, you see the other possible combinations. Now, the interesting thing is, if you want examples, for these country diets, if you look at the United Kingdom, all of them are present in the United Kingdom as a destination country because it has so many special arrangements with other countries. South Africans in the United Kingdom can participate in all elections in the UK and in South Africa, in the national elections at least. Whereas Uruguayans in the UK cannot participate in any elections, neither in Uruguay nor in the UK. So especially the last diagnosis that there is this position where migrants become completely disenfranchised as a result of their migration from country A to country B. That should be worrying for international organizations like IDEA. So we tried to then quantify this by looking at how many combinations are of that kind. And you see the dark gray area where there is, again, a decline in these country combinations where migrants are completely disenfranchised. And where you see the lighter gray area in the middle, where the biggest increase is, and that's clearly diaspora voting, but diaspora voting without also having a vote in the country of residence, right? And on the minor increase in the upper section there, lighter gray, where you have migrants have the local franchise where they reside and the diaspora franchise where they come from. So that's the normative optimum, if you want. At least that minimum. It would be even better if they also have the national franchise. And that's the final slide. Then we have, like the report does, we've used UN data on estimated stocks of migrants from countries of citizenship in countries of residence. And so you can quantify this by coming up with a very, very rough estimate. What's the number of migrants globally that are completely disenfranchised and those that are fully disenfranchised? And you see these in this bar chart. don't give too much attention to the numbers, because as we all know, UN data are problematic in many ways. Some go by citizenship, some go by country of birth, etc. So it's not always completely reliable, but it's the best estimate that we can come up with. And I think I want to leave it there.
Thank you very much. I didn't expect to see the data, and especially not the data just released. So really grateful, and I think this is really an important thing to think about going forward, especially those that are completely deprived of their right to vote. Given the time, I am thinking that maybe we would take a little round of questions from the audience, because otherwise we would not allow you to take questions. So if there are questions here, then please let colleagues know there is a microphone out there. And if not, I have two questions from our online audience, but let's hear from the room first. Oh, I see a person in red tie.
Thank you very much. May I start by congratulating IDEA for the excellent Global State of Democracy 2025 report. I have just one question to all distinguished panels, who I admire very much. In what other ways, in addition to casting vote, can diaspora give new weight, new value to the quality of democracy in their country of origins, as well as in their countries of residence? Thank you.
Wow, this is quite a question, I have to say. Do you have a question as well?
My specific question is with regard to the democratic project, where diaspora, as Professor Rayner has said, actually tend to vote on the right, and I don't know how much evidence there is on that, voting for the right that actually kills some of the democratic rights in the home country. Let me put it that way. And this is, of course, based on many experiences, including my own country. I was just wondering if there is an implication with regard to the difference, if there is already some data on differences in the voting patterns between the first generation of the diaspora and the second generation, who have hopefully imbibed, if they are in countries where democratic ideals are being taught, and the second generation would probably vote differently. At the same time, I don't know if there's data on that, but this is something that we in the advocacy for democratic voting rights, not just the right to vote, but the substance of the voting, are working on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I, mindful of time, will take one more question.
Thank you. I am Shkandia Getzi, Ambassador of Kosovo. You've mentioned Kosovo in this report. We organized elections for the first time in the embassy premises, and they were very successful, given the fact that we have a very engaged diaspora politically and financially, remittances-wise. And however, we have local elections approaching soon, and given that I'm not a policymaker, so I just want to ask you, what's your stance on local elections, the right of diaspora to vote, given the fact that migration oftentimes is driven by starting from security, safety, to having better working and living conditions? From this perspective, do you think they affect legitimacy? And if their votes are decisive, then how democratic is this? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
This is the temptation of asking a question to the our very distinguished panel, is about the relationship between the democratic remittances and the actual remittances. I'm just wondering if the extent to which a country becomes highly dependent on economic remittances plays a role in the willingness of their political actors to expand the voting rights of the diaspora, or not, or maybe those are two completely separate phenomena.
And I have one question that I asked before, and I will repeat here, but also one question specific to you, Maria. And the question was a very technical question. The question from the audience online is, I have read that Cabo Verde is seeking to implement e-voting technology in the next elections. Is this technology also being used in diaspora distance voting? So that's a question very technical to you, but I also wanted to ask a bigger question, which is close to my heart, as people who know me know very well, which is how can out-of-country voting systems be designed to ensure equal participation and representation, especially with regards to women equal participation and representation. So let's start with the technical question, because I think it's easy, and mindful of the time. As interesting as these questions are, please be concise in your answers.
Thank you very much. Yes, we in Cape Verde, we are talking about voting. Yes, is important. We are working in technical issues, but unfortunately, it will be not possible to implement it in the next elections in 2026. And we are in this moment, we are working already in Portugal. We began with diaspora to improve and to introduce technology in electoral registers. So it means that we will begin with diaspora and then to come to Cape Verde, to the territory. So we want to emphasize these questions. In this moment, we are already working in Portugal to improve our voter register and introducing the technology to be automatically. So then we come to home. Thank you.
So your innovation is first outside and then at home. Linda.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. Your question intrigued me because I just realized all the voting hubs for Kenya are the strongest remittance corridors. So where they have the voting booths are in UAE, Qatar, US, Canada. And I feel like I never thought of that correlation or that relationship. And I think the government is aware of where majority of the Kenyans are. So that's where they actually even go and have political campaigns and engagements with them prior to. So I feel like there is a direct connection. And it'll be interesting to sort of interrogate that a bit further in terms of Kenya. I never thought about that until you mentioned it. Then the question about diaspora, how can you engage, the first question, and how you can innovatively engage the diaspora, the gentleman at the back. I think diaspora has a lot of information and a lot of experience and expertise, but I feel like sometimes some countries don't effectively engage them in the right way. They have the technology, they have the expertise to actually design these e-voting platforms, but the engagement is not there. Even when you look at the policies, it's all about economic development. So it's not so much on the political engagement aspect. So I feel like if they open that door, it could be an avenue for them to strengthen or address some of the gaps on the voting process. But that's something I don't think even in my space and even in the engagement space that I've seen people actually engaging in that aspect. But that's an avenue that they can explore somehow. But maybe I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, the difficult questions land with you.
Okay. Okay, I'll try to take them in reverse order as quickly as possible. So on your question, how could we design OCV to ensure equal representation and participation? I would say most important thing is go for automatic registration of diaspora voters. And then, since this doesn't necessarily overcome the gender discrepancy, start awareness campaigns along with that. But automatic registration is most important lever we have for increasing turnout, as we've seen in some of the statistics. The Secretary General's very important question of what's the relation between democratic remittances and economic remittances. Is the size of economic remittances does it explain why countries introduce out-of-country voting? There are basically two hypotheses why countries introduce out-of-country voting. One is a top-down and the other one is a bottom-up hypothesis. Bottom-up would be the diaspora gains so much clout, especially through its remittances, that the incumbents in the government have to offer it the vote in order to, channel the pressure that comes from the diaspora. But the opposite also happens. An incumbent political party thinks that it can capture the majority of the diaspora vote if it enfranchises the diaspora. One example for the first is probably Mexico in the 1990s. Example for the Philippines. An example for the second mechanism would be a country like Italy, that introduced the diaspora vote in the hope that the right would benefit, which turned out to be false for the first elections where the diaspora could vote. Sometimes incumbents are wrong about the electoral calculus. The question about local elections, very important one. It's an interesting observation that there are virtually no countries, or very few, that enfranchise their diasporas to vote in local elections in the country of origin. And there's a significant number of countries that enfranchise their non-citizen immigrants in the local election. And that tells you something about the complementarity between democracy at the local level and at the national level. At the national level, it seems more obvious for countries that the diasporas need to be included, whereas at the local level, it's about cohabitation of a resident population that consumes the same kinds of public services and wants to hold the local governments accountable. They have a reasonable claim to be included independently of their citizenship and without having to go through naturalization. And more countries, well, it's still a minority, but some countries heed this claim. I think one ought to embrace both. It's not either or. You can say that enfranchising the immigrants at the local level is a local conception of citizenship. Whereas at the national level, the diaspora can also be enfranchised because the diasporas are naturally linked to the national level. Then there was the question about first and second generation electoral behavior. Unfortunately, I can't answer it because I don't study electoral behavior. So I have no data, but it's a very interesting question to ask. And finally, the question by the gentleman with the red tie was there, in which other ways can diasporas contribute to democracy apart from the voting process? In many ways, and they do. There is a transnationalization not only of the political realm, but of civil society. Diasporas stay connected through social media channels, through frequent travels with their home countries, and they can contribute to the health of civil society in their country of origin through these activities. Provided that they're invited to, that they are not just seen as members of an extended family that were sent abroad for migration, but as members of the society that they have left, and are invited to contribute also to the strength of civil society itself. But that's the only answer I can give. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. I wish we had more time. This is a fascinating discussion, but we unfortunately have to close this panel, and thanking you all very much and thanking the audience for the questions. I will hand back to Jessica.
Thank you so much, Katarzyna. Please let us give a round of applause to this wonderful panel. Thank you all so much for this great discussion. It was really, really interesting. As we bring the event to a close, we are pleased to share a first draft visualization of today's conversation, which was illustrated live in real time by Edwin Stoop as a way to capture and summarize the key takeaways. That is really cool. I'm sure we will. So we can share with the participants. That is very, very cool. Thank you. I warmly encourage all of you to further explore the 2025 Global State of Democracy Report, Democracy on the Move. You can access this through our International Ideas social media channels, or of course by this lovely QR code that's displayed on the screen right now. I also want to bring your attention to our Democracy Tracker, which offers monthly updates on democracy and human rights developments in 173 countries, which you will find on the website at idea.int/democracy tracker. On behalf of International IDEA, I extend our sincere gratitude to all of our speakers today for this thought-provoking discussion and to everyone who joined us online and of course here in person. We really appreciate your continued support of International IDEA. For those of you who are here in the room, there is a reception that will start immediately after, so we warmly invite you to stay. Thank you once again, and we look forward to welcoming you back to International IDEA.